The college basketball season is almost halfway over. The year has turned. Happy New Year. We want to talk about the most loaded conference when it comes to freshman darts for the 2025 draft cycle. I speak, of course, of the Big Ten and several players that might go in the top 10 in 2025. Welcome to Chucking Darts, a podcast of informed, rigorous, reckless, harmless, speculative, and fun predictions about the game we love. You can call me Chuck. This is episode number 219. Episode 218 was another draft episode with Brian Geisinger on the ACC. We talked about all the non-Duke prospects because episode 217 was Cooper Flagg, Con
Mm.
Knipple, Kamal Malawach. 219 was Maxime Renault, Ian Jackson, who has kept popping off since we talked about him. Jameer Watkins, Hunter Salas, some familiar names, but also Jacob Kofi, Drake Powell, uh, uh, Zach Austin, who's a guy of mine on Pitt, probably won't get drafted, but who I will never stop believing in. A
Mm.
very fun conversation. Brian's the best at what he does with the ACC, so please go and check that out. But today for the Big Ten, I am very happy to have on, I think for your first time on my feed,
Mhm.
Caleb Miller of the Center Hub, formerly on the clock. Center Hub, for those who, I mean, most people listening to this probably know what Center Hub is, but it is as far as the space goes, relatively new project and website and publication that has a subscription aspect to it, but does everything that you could hope to do in the draft. And it features a lot of up and coming young talent. Caleb is sort of the mastermind behind it. And I couldn't wait to have him on, not only because I wanted to make sure people knew about Center Hub, but because when it comes to the Big Ten and it comes to Dylan Harper and it comes to Kasparas Jakucionis, Ace Bailey, Derek Queen, these are the freshmen we're going to be talking about today. Caleb has been on them all season and really prior to the season, and I wanted to get his thoughts. But before we get to them, let's get to him. Caleb, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. I'm extremely humbled and I appreciate the introduction. I've been a long time listener, and before I started, could consider myself as someone who, is in this space, basketball scouting or, basketball scouting media work, however you want to toss it up. I was somebody who could consider a fan of the program. So I'm definitely happy to be here. I've been a long time dart thrower myself. And the center hub is definitely people built out of that mindset. For the most part, we have like 20 or so draft contributors that'll make their way around, like Chuck said, our website, thecenterhub.com. And, you can drop that link in the description. I'll send it over to you, Chuck. And,
Certainly.
that's the best place to check all of us out. And really the only thing that, I can promote here. It's something that, I care deeply about. Like Chuck said, I reached out to a lot of people that I know care about the game of basketball as much as I do, from a quality sense and a quality reporting sense. And I think something that we all want to see more from our mainstream media, especially in the basketball side, is a little bit more focus on the nitty gritty and talking about the whole story and some of the more important areas of like the game of basketball itself, rather than kind of giving us broad strokes. And that's really what we try to get into. Like Chuck said, previously with On the Clock, a big part of what I worked on was deep diving into college basketball, either in the cracks of the country in terms of underclassmen talent looking to transfer up, or diving into the nitty gritty of the draft classes that we've had over the last couple years. And that's what we've just been continuing to do, but trying to grow as a community. The Center Hub, I definitely can say, is a group of great guys, and a couple gals that have definitely care about the sport. So I can definitely promote that and say, if you're somebody who enjoys basketball, loves the game, loves to hear about different stories, or even just regular old draft scout reporting or weekly reporting, big time news, whatever it may be, we're going to continue to grow and it's all going to be there. So go to the link in the description, thecenterhub.com dash in between the
Yeah,
dash hub.
the-center-hub.com. But it'll be in the description, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
Yeah. Appreciate that. I
And
appreciate the plug.
no, it's great. I love seeing that, like, because I knew you before it existed. I love seeing it now up and running, and that you've been able to attract so many talented people to contribute to it. And, it keeps, I mean, I'm not some, I mean, maybe I'm turning into some sort of weird draft Twitter like fossil, which is fine by me. I just like basketball, but I like seeing that space evolve with people who have the mindset of wanting to learn and communicate as much about the game as they can. So I really appreciate the Center Hub, as I do a couple other publications who I feel like do that very well.
Yeah, I
So
mean, shout out some of my favorites. Swish Theory does some great stuff, and they're another group of younger guys that do phenomenal work. And someone who we're all a big fan of. And I'm no shame in promoting all these other places that people consider us competitors with. It's all I see and take from those people is inspiration. Shout out No Ceilings. We'd be nothing without those guys. And any breath or sentence where I'd talk about anything that I've done, those guys all have inspired me, and yourself has given me so much confidence to reach out to some of these brilliant people. Shout out Sheed and ATL has been one of my favorite writers in the basketball community and creators on Twitter. Does incredibly detailed and just quality work for us on a consistent and weekly basis. And as somebody who, again, who, I've been there, who, feels like when they first come into this space, like it's all uphill battle. And we're a place that tries to offer people like, resources to get that next jump. So, if people are looking for a place to write about basketball, feel free to reach out to me as well. You can, find my links via the Center Hub channel, or can put my ad as well in the
yeah,
description.
I'll be
People
sure to
can
do
reach out
that.
to me. My
Excellent.
DMs are always open to talk hoops.
Yeah. Well, let's get to them. Let's get to
Mhm.
them because the Big Ten, which now encompasses roughly 47 schools across the country, is really the, I guess, hotbed of the scouting community for this season because there are these really high profile freshmen who are going to go in the lottery. What I find so, well, you posted a board, and I'll just ask you this straight away, several weeks ago, where you had Kasparas Jakucionis, freshman guard, Illinois, number one,
Mhm.
Dylan Harper, freshman guard, Rutgers, number two. That in and of itself is different than a lot of boards because Cooper Flag is, the presumptive number one pick. And you had Ace Bailey, I believe, number nine, maybe Derek Queen, number seven or eight, like right around
Mhm.
there. All four of those guys in the top 10. We're
Yeah.
going to go one by one. We'll start with Yakashonis, but I
Sweet.
wanted to ask you if that is still, if you still, as far as Yakashonis and Harper, if they are still one and two to you as you sift your way through scouting this season in this class.
Yeah, I mean, I can give a board update. I was actually like kind of about ready to throw one out there tomorrow. So if those of you are listening, feel free to go check it out. Yeah, I still have Jakucionis at one and Harper at two, with Flag at three. I moved Derek Queen up to number five. He's hopped over Common Malik and VJ Edgecombe in my eyes. And I have Ace Bailey still at number eight, with Jeremiah Fears, who's been really awesome. Speaking of
Mm-hmm.
freshmen, who's creeping up on his tail, and it's been somebody that I really foresaw him being somebody who's going to be super impressive. I put out a tweet that I've retweeted like 3 or 4 times at the Center Hub account, about how, just there was a perfect storm for him at Oklahoma and some of the skills that he has. I really feel the same way about Jakucionis. I will say about the Big Ten, I feel like I can't escape it. I moved from Wisconsin to California, and the Big Ten followed me the same year. It's definitely been a really, really fun year to consume. Still like Big Ten basketball on the network television where I'm at. So Illinois has been a team I've been able to catch a bunch in terms of live games. And I've heard a good bit of people talk about Yakuchonis as like, not necessarily having this wow factor or not necessarily being somebody that blows you away athletically, where, Cooper Flag definitely has some verticality and has shown us a lot of highlights over the years. And I think that's something that's definitely etched into people's minds and opinions. Whereas Kasparas just does basketball things that are like impressive to somebody who especially coaches the game and tries to coach guards, to, utilize ball fakes, utilize screens correctly, and then make plays out of those consistently. He checks a lot of those boxes. And then when you get into off-ball work that he still does at Illinois and that he showed in Lithuania, with some of the stuff coming into the year, especially this last summer, um, his shooting talent is, I think, pretty criminally underrated. Um, the volume, we'll see. In terms of, I don't know what his NBA, shot creation ability will be, and I think that's going to be a big knock on people in terms of what their requirement in terms of an elite guard is.
Hmm.
But he's showed up on defense, in terms of, just competing, which is, the bare minimum. And then you see a lot of these small plays where he utilizes his IQ, and positioning to make excellent plays and reads on the defensive end. That I think has kept him in, the top three conversation in a lot of people's eyes. And I think, myself, I get a little overexcited at times to think about guys' offensive potential, but, seeing him as an engine, I think, these are what your prototype, kind of point guards and lead guards are going to look like in the NBA, especially when you're trying to build around shot creators. I think he made Will Riley look exceptionally well early in the year, and has still made a lot of those guys on that team look really good. Tomislav Visic is a great player and somebody I have, borderline first round, but
Hmm.
Kasparas has made him look really, really strong in terms of getting him the ball in the right spots on the floor at the right times, to just bully mismatches on a consistent basis. They've been a really tough team to guard, and freshman guards don't typically do that. And I think we have to give props there, and I think that that's why I've stayed strong at that spot, to give a long-winded answer to your question.
That's okay. That's okay. Long, you preach into a long-winded choir, my friend.
Hmm.
But let's get to just for some general numbers on Kasparas, and they're almost all impressive. He's at about 16 and a half points a game, 5.5 rebounds, 5.5 assists, uh, just under 50, 40, 88 splits. I think he's about just under 50% from the field, 41% from three, just under 88% on the lot from the line, all on healthy volume. Like he is a lead guard, lead initiator, no question. When he's on the floor, the ball is in his hands. And Illinois has a good amount of talent around him, not just Ivisic, who's a true pick and pop big. He can also score down low, but he provides a stretch element that college basketball usually doesn't have. And Humrickhouse, I forget where he came from, what program he transferred up from.
Evansville, I'm pretty
Evansville, there
sure.
you go. But he's a 6'9" power forward who's also a real shooting threat too. So just from a spacing perspective, Illinois can stretch a lot of defenses, and they hung 109 points in Oregon, I think last Thursday or Friday, which was a real, 30-point statement road win for them. Something that to this point, Rutgers, which has, Dylan Harper, who's ranked ahead of Kasparas on, I think, a lot of boards and mocks. They don't really have that similar kind of statement victory. And then they just beat, I believe, Washington on the road as well over the weekend. So
Yeah, I mean,
Illinois came out, I think they are 11th in the country, AP, and Kasparas is at the controls. You mentioned some of the things you really like about him, but I want to hone in on the shooting. You said that
mm,
you thought his shooting talent was really underrated. And I want to just drive this home, understanding that we're only halfway through the season. But Kasparas is listed at 6'6". Probably he plays, I would say, around sort of 6'5", because he's not an above the rim athlete, as you mentioned. But among freshmen, going back to 2008, this is again using the Bartorvik database, among freshmen who have any sort of three-point volume at all, his true shooting is in basically the top five in that database. The top true shooting number belonged to Reed Shepherd last year, drafted third overall. Reed's usage, however, was under 20. Kasparas's is at 25. Uh, Marcus Howard, Marquette, had a great true shooting number, but he was 5'11". Lonzo Ball Was true shooting, 67, the UCLA running that really sort of revolutionary kind of offense. But like Reed, his usage was only part-time. His usage was around 20. And then you have Kasparas, who's, his true shooting is 66, which is an insane number, and his usage is 25. So an argument could be made that he is basically the most efficient freshman, the most efficient scoring freshman that has any sort of 3-point volume and like real lead guard usage going back, 18 years, which
Yeah, and I
is
mean
a
he's not
really
even
good
shooting that.
reason to rank him very highly. So tell me what about his shooting you love so much, why you think it is going to translate so fantastically at the NBA level.
Well, I mean, when I look for certain things, especially like just looking at a stat sheet, or like especially like a synergy database, I think the thing that always I look to is how are you shooting on catch and shoot shots that are open.
Mm-hmm.
I think Kasparas is relatively underperformed this year in that area. And that's normally an area where you can expect a player to then elevate kind of to the other areas where they're shooting. And he's somebody that, is already shooting, like you said, fantastically well. And I say he's underrated because I think some people do think shooting is, sometimes is just about that, catch and shoot shot. How quick can you get that release off? Are you, knocked down? And I think Kasparas has shown that he's relatively capable of generating a lot of different types of looks from 3-point range, which I think is something that got me really attracted to Igor Demon as a
Mm-hmm.
creator. And I think it's something that we see from guys like Luka Doncic and Steph Curry, where they're able to kind of offset and, get the defense off balance in order to create a different 3-point shot from already a 3-point stance. And I think he does a lot of that very well in terms of his step backs. And that's where we've seen, his dribble 3-point percentages, pretty absurd. I think it's like um I was just looking at it. I was about to run a different query too to give you an idea of like what type of class he is in terms of uh production. But he's shooting 46.7% on dribble 3-point shots, 3.2 assists attempts per game, which is, like you said, a pretty solid volume. But it is like an unusual diet for him where, he's shooting, around 5 attempts per game. And, 3/5, 60% of those are off the dribble. So I think we'll have to see what that looks like in the NBA. And like I said at the top, he showed a lot in Lithuania, playing next to guys like Paulius Moraskis, Matejus Krivas, who, the Lithuania team wants to utilize those bigger players that have skill, and then have had really polished, games, especially like coming from Arizona, a season at Arizona, both of them.
Yeah, how
We sh
far back do you go with Jakucionis? Like how much of his pre-Illinois tape have
Last
you been
year,
able to
last
review?
year I really dived in, and all credits out to Sheetan ATL. He's somebody that reinformed, like, he's from Lithuania, reaffirmed, and like he's like we've never had a prospect like this. Like he's been like this for a long time, and then when you dive into the Cerebro archives and Synergy archives, you're like, why weren't we talking about this guy in the same breath as Igor Demon? And that's, I think, some of that, like, I thought I was like, Igor Demon's gonna be great. He's the, the big plus size European guard for this class. But Jakucionis like caught my attention like entering into the year, and then we set a bunch on 6 Month Madness. Like we were like, he could be really, really, really good. And there were some reports out of the Illinois preseason stuff that he was going to be phenomenal. I think that's when it really cemented to me that this is a kid who probably could be like a top 10 pick. Especially with like what I was seeing from the off ball stuff. It's like when you're that good of a playmaker, like, yeah, you can be great. There's Alexander Gava Loyagov for Villanova, who's a 6'2" guard, really shifty, probably better creator in terms of side to side than Igor and Kasparas in terms of, creating space, getting downhill. And he has some of that playmaking juice too. But both those guys with their size and what they're able to do in terms of leveraging mismatches, and then from an IQ perspective, both Igor and Kasparas, just like the minute they stepped on the college basketball court, that's something I look for from the jump is can you generate easy looks when they're there? And, you know, he passes that test with flying colors every game. And, I'm just waiting for the bad game. So that way, I can kind of go and evaluate some tape that's a little frustrating. I think the turnovers have been there a little bit more in terms of ones that I'm like, I would have probably held that a second longer, maybe a fake theirs, or like, ah, good idea. We need to execute. I don't have as many of those. I have a little fewer of those moments with Demon, and from a playmaking perspective, but I get way more excited with Kasparas when he's shooting this well off the dribble. And then you go back and look at some of the stuff at Lithuania where he's shooting really well off the catch, and he's stable as a shooter. Then, um, enforces my confidence in him to kind of translate in that area, especially.
Well, you mentioned a little bit some sort of some critiques of his game. You mentioned the turnovers, which we'll get to, but the one I want to focus on, which is chained, I think, to his turnovers, is his ability, or I guess the ways in which he creates and seizes space. Because what sticks out to me, just watching him in the games that I've watched him in, is that he is what I believe is sort of like a very, very good mistake punisher. If as a defender you over pursue, or certainly if you go under a screen, or if you take a bad angle in shading him towards the middle of the floor, he will gobble all of that up. If you're handsy on his drives, he will sell that contact and get a call. He will take a lane when it's given, and unless you're funneling him to exactly the right place, and the bodies are there on time to rotate, he's likely going to score or pass the ball to a very productive place on the floor. However, if someone is guarding him well and guarding him straight up, he's not necessarily a sort of mistake causer with his dribble and with his handle.
Mhm.
Not drastic horizontal movement that he creates. He has his step back three that he gets to, but that step back three almost seems like he goes to it out of necessity as opposed to going to it because he just knows he can destroy a defender by doing it. I that part of it is frequently sort of an eye test thing that a lot of people, myself included, look for if we're looking for sort of radical top of the draft guard kind of athletes. So in terms of just sort of his space creation, what he can do basically from a standstill, what are you seeing, and if it does not give you pause, why does it not give you pause?
Um, like I said, I think some of that stuff definitely concerns me. When I look at this draft class, um, as a scout, I've definitely started to reflect more on the idea that there doesn't always have to be that guy who's going to be the number one option on a championship team in a draft class. I think we definitely saw
Mm-hmm.
that last year. And I don't think that we're looking as much as that this year, but I think when we look at, especially with the top three players on my board, and I think what will turn into a consensus top three, at some point in terms of maybe not order, but definitely the people that are talked about, especially, top tier freshmen. I think Derek Queen, the more he plays and the more people buy into kind of what he can do versatility wise, he'll have more fans in the top three. But I s- I think that Kasparas, if you write him off just because he can't always, create that space and create that, mistake like you're talking about, um, I think you run into an issue where he's able to, not necessarily always create the mistake, but he in that initiator role, you're not always looking for that guy to be that. TJ McConnell or like some of these like high tier lead guards that come off the bench in terms of initiating aren't always the greatest mistake causers, but what they
Mm-hmm.
do greatly is put the best players on their team in terms of the best mistake causers in a position to cause mistakes. And you can see this on basketball courts at all levels where guys that have that IQ and don't necessarily have that athletic ability tend to get put in those roles where they are those distributors and table setters. In the modern NBA, I don't think we have as many of those guys in those prominent roles, so I don't think that we tend to pair, you know, elite distributor with top three talent and top three potential return. But I think with Kasparas, where you have to look is he is so refined in some of these areas, like you're talking about, where if there is a mistake in front of him, it'll be punished every single time. I'll take a guy who can get me that instead of somebody who maybe overdoes it or is overzealous in that moment where we just need to punish the defense. Um, like an Ace Bailey or somebody like that, where the play doesn't always get made. Um, and then you can also give me small moments where in transition, when you look at what he does in transition, I'd call that mistake, causing. Especially when you're a player who isn't as athletically gifted. If you're able to consistently pick apart the open man, I consider that mistake causing in terms of a good swing pass or good timing on a ball fake. I still think some of that stuff tends to be undervalued. And I think when you go watch that Washington tape and you look at him compared to guys that are just simply not on NBA level, you can see that he is able to pick apart even against those 6'2", 6'3" guards that are going to try and get in his chest and challenge him pace wise. I think he does a good job of being able to find those moments where he was able to push his own agenda, but also recognize that it doesn't always have to be your game to be the number one guy. I think, um, one thing that's, for me is it makes Cooper Flag, I think having him at three isn't necessarily a knock. I think he's still a phenomenal player. But I don't think Cooper Flag is always has shown me this year that in those moments where he needs to either defer or go get a bucket, he's not always making the right decision. Where I feel like in those moments where I think Casper should defer, he's deferring, or where Casper should you know, push his agenda and push to score, he tends to push to score. And I think in terms of like a coach, especially NBA coaches, you don't get like a lot of players where you can kind of have that guy, um, you know, as your like offensive engine where he can kind of play any offensive role you really want to with good size at 6'5", and still is, 18, has a long way to grow.
Well, so you said a lot there. I think
Hmm.
in terms of saying, you would want to have a guy like this on your team. Like I'm sure every NBA team would like to have a
Hmm.
guy like Kasparas on their team. It's just a question of like valuing it. When you value it all the way to the tippy top, even if you think this draft doesn't have a number one initiator, I think that may very well be true. But regardless, if you view everyone as sort of, I don't even want to say number two option necessarily, but like if everyone in this class is going to need to have some sort of connector skill because they don't, no one is going to have the ability to just drive an offense all on their own. Then,
Unless they're going to be a bench or a role player.
well,
Like, I
sure,
mean,
sure, but that's not what we're talking about. We're
some
talking
teams
about the
like the
top five.
Trailblazers, yeah, some teams like the Trailblazers are going to need a guy like an Ace Bailey to come in and shoot a bunch of shots, or a Trey Johnson to develop as somebody who's a high usage guy. You know what I mean?
Yes, I mean that's a different discussion. Like
Mm,
I think it is a worthy question to say, well, if for example, a team that, let's say the Brooklyn Nets, which are, the cupboard's going to be relatively bare. If
mm-hmm.
they are picking at the top of this draft and they think to themselves, we want to take some player that, with the idea that they're going to come in and shoot a bunch of shots. I don't think the fact that you have a scoring vacuum on your team necessitates that you take a player that can shoot those shots. I think you would still just want to take the best piece to build with. Do you believe
100%.
that Jakucionis is still the best piece to build with in the class, or does the number one ranking for you connote something else?
Well, yeah, I think that the number one ranking for me does still kind of like mean, and that I'm putting him in that spot of where, like, I think he is definitely a player to build around. If you look at his synergy efficiencies right now per play type, and you kind of plug in where he's at in terms of efficiency wise, I put in into one of my databases that I've shared with you previously, a historical one, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes back to 2010. and it's pre draft years. And if you go transition PP points per possession, isolation points per possession, pick and roll scoring, off screen scoring, handoff scoring, like kind of like your basic like main creator initiator scoring stuff. If the season were to end today, the only three players that have even scraped like Yakuchonis's efficiencies. And then if I threw on spot up, it wouldn't even be fair. But it's Frank Kaminsky, Zion Williamson, and Spencer Dinwiddie. So I think that there is some like juice there where he is displaying to us right now that he's more than capable of being an efficient offensive engine in a multitude of different ways. If you compare volumes on some of those, I'm sure we could get nitpicky with where he's at in terms of some of those efficiencies, historically, like just straight up total production wise. But I never like to use like synergy numbers to like try and prove my point. But I think it does paint the broad stroke that he has been able to like maybe not necessarily in terms of the conventional presentation, but from an efficiency and sheer like production in those moments he's been about as efficient as they come, like you pointed out at the top, especially as a shooter. And then, when you talk about a guy who's used in just offensive actions frequently in a bunch of different ways, which tends to be somebody we consider as an engine, I guess. What I mean? Zion, especially for Duke, maybe wasn't as much in terms of like, obviously a guard stuff. But if you go back and watch Frank Kaminsky, Wisconsin, and some of the high post touches and stuff like that, like he's still a guy that was able to, be in those moments, not necessarily be a mistake creator like you're talking about, but be somebody who can punish those mismatches. And I think Kasparas presents a lot more quality NBA traits outside of just production than Frank Kaminsky did. And I was, obviously a Wisconsinite, big Frank Kaminsky fan. I probably would have had him top 10 on my big board. But like, I think that we can all agree like Kasparas at 18 is much more further along than Frank Kaminsky ever has been maybe in terms of like pro potential
Hmm.
especially from like aptitude perspective. So when I look at some of the guys that you can comp there, like Spencer Dinwiddie is not a bad like role to project either in terms of like what he's probably going to be looking at in the NBA if he's able to show some of this continuous growth as a off the dribble shooter. What I mean? Teams are going to continue to feed into that usage, I'm sure, especially if he gets in a situation like the Nets. I would be more than comfortable, saying, hey, this is our guy this year, you know, next year we're still gonna have a good pick. We can go get one of these guys who's actually a tier one player like AJ or Cam. And then, I'm totally cool. I don't need to push Cooper Flag to be Cam Boozer. You know what I mean? Like that's where I think a lot of people try and map Cooper Flag out. And I think when you get tied up in RCSI rankings and some of the like stuff we've talked about where there's no doubt that being like the guy and being a top major player, and we'll talk about with that pedigree with Dylan Harper and why I think he's the number two player and able to
Hmm.
make an argument over Cooper Flag is um Kasparas Jakucionis has that same pedigree. I talked about, people from Lithuania have known about this kid since he was 15. You know what I mean? In their basketball circles. Like he's been there like once in a generation prospect. And I see what they're talking about in terms of he encapsulates a lot of quality European fundamentals and lays them out quite excellently in college basketball. How that turns out in the NBA, we'll have to see, but I think he continues to surprise me with some of the pass fakes and just his how deep his bag is.
Okay. Well, then let's explore that a little bit. All right.
Hmm.
Because on the one hand, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but when you speak about, a Spencer Dinwiddie kind of role, that is not the role of a number one pick in a draft. Even if you are imagining him as being some sort of super connector, and we can sort of define who that is in terms of sort of melding off ball usage with on ball usage, I think a number one
Hmm.
pick could be that. In fact, I think that if you're looking for a potential number one pick, teams should be more scrutinizing about the off-ball potential or lack thereof that a particular player has. I think on-ball usage is sort of focused on a bit too much. However, there still has to be an avenue to where the number one player really in any draft like makes an all NBA team. If you're not talking about that sort of ceiling with someone, then chances are they're not the best player in their class. Even, maybe last year is like this weird exception of a class, but for the most part, especially if you're talking about a one and done player like Kasparas or Dylan or Derek or Ace or Cooper, you're looking for that long road to sort of elite level overall
Mhm.
production. I'm not writing Kasparas off on that, but we talked about the space creation a little bit. The turnover percentage, which is high, which is probably sort of the one statistical blemish on his resume. To me, what I see him do is when he gets into the paint, he will, he has a very healthy free throw rate, draws a lot of fouls because he's very,
Mhm.
very clever. Like I said, if your hand placement is off, or if you are going to bite on a shot fake, or you're going to leave your feet or be in the wrong spot, he will like seek that out and weaponize it immediately. But if you are just sort of playing strong and straight up in the post, he's not going to jump over you. And chances are what he has gone to doing is sort of stopping on 2 feet in the post, trying a couple up fakes. If he can't bait a foul call that way, then he'll start to pass into traffic, or he'll get down there and leave his feet, knowing that he can't pull off some really athletic finish above the rim and try some
Mhm.
sort of jump pass that is ill advised.
Mhm.
Occasionally, he'll get blitzed and his pocket will get picked, but I'm not as worried about that. More the sort of decision making in the lane. What do you
Yeah.
attribute, like for someone who is such a high field prospect, because Casper's is
Mhm.
a really high field handle, high field connector passing vision, like he is very high field. What do you attribute that sort of decision making hiccup that I think I'm seeing when he has so much feel everywhere else on the floor?
It's a big thing that, I'm in terms of what you're talking about with, getting 2 feet into the paint and strong decision making is at the core of basketball. Um, and it's a great point, especially when, it's something I nitpick a lot with Igor Demin, and something I see that, they both similarly have. I think some of it has to do with physicality and like you're talking about. I think some of it's, um, a little bit of that lacking of that quick twitch athleticism to make that acrobatic play. Um, and I think some of it falls back on, like I said, where you look at a lot of like his best work is when he's making those quick decisions coming out of the pick and roll and not when he's getting into some of those spots on the floor. And I think that that's a lot of film room work, and that those are things that you can teach an intelligent guard to work on and grow. And especially when he's been relatively efficient. I mean, 12% turnover percentage, I think it is in like pick and roll, including passes.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking
Mm-hmm.
at earlier, which is like not like it's not god awful. You know what I mean? I've seen a lot worse in terms of prospects that I've evaluated, especially freshmen. But especially when like there's so few teams that he's faced so far that are that have trapped him really or blitzed a lot of the PNR. Uh, he's been like relatively like poor at navigating that, especially in the ISO. Those are where, he continually needs to, find ways to set himself up in better situations. I think when you're talking about a high field guy, you return to again like the long term, especially with guards. Um, I think with somebody like him, I can buy into um some of like this more like NBA centric offense like working out for him, if that makes sense. Like more spacing, kind of being able to leverage and alleviate some of those problems where he's getting crowded up in the paint. I don't think he's gonna play with a ton of back to the basket bigs with a lot of the teams I will play with. Obviously we don't see a lot in the NBA much that much anymore at all. Um, but I mean, there's some of these touches on Illinois' offense where there just isn't like a ton of that mature ball movement. And he can get jammed. but no, I think I see some things happen with Dylan Harper in the same spots. I think we'll see it, just commonly across freshman guards, especially when you're coming from Europe. You've never played against really like high caliber athletes. A lot of those are mistakes that, I see as well, where it's like you get stuck in the paint and you can't make a play because it's a turnover or you're getting your shot blocked. And then you're kind of stuck with whatever decision you've been left with. And obviously that's just, poor basketball as coordinates. And it's something that, like I said, I was kind of talking about where I see more of those moments with Kasparas than I do with Igor. In terms of like where I'm just like, that shouldn't have how that play should have panned out. But I still buy into the fact that, when he is setting the table for some of these guys that are a little bit more elite scorers, athletes, and he's facing, still these elite athletes and defenders like he's going to face in the NBA. Um, I think that, more maturity, more time, better teammates, some of these things will smooth out. And especially like I think we've seen still his turnover percentages have gone down like relatively slowly. I ran like a regression analysis early in the year and was looking at like freshman guard turnover percentages. And he was like his was regressing like, pretty similarly to Dylan Harper's. Um, but it is an area where I think Harper's like a little bit like stronger. Where I buy into him more in that like traffic, advantage creation stuff in the paint. If you want to pivot the combo there, because that's where something he's obviously super strong with.
I do want to get to Harper soon. I agree with that about a difference between them, but I want to stay on Kasparis for just a bit more because
I'm with it.
most one and done guards that are, top of the draft talents that you can, any of them over the last 10 years or so, going back to sort of Derrick Rose, John Wall, Kyrie Irving, De'Aaron Fox, uh, a lot of these players, I guess Scoot Henderson recently, no matter where their NBA career has taken them, what has made them clear one and done players has been sort of the athletic ability with the ball in their hands. And I
Mm,
think Dylan, when we get to him, Dylan is not quite at the level of most of those people, but he's certainly closer. You see sort of the strength that he has executing his dribble and getting downhill. And you see, like, oh, well, that's sort of NBA physicality, NBA strength that he can play with. It is very rare to have a player, even though Casper's is in a lead guard role with Illinois, it is rare to have a player sort of project these sort of connector skills, which, and you talked about the fundamentals that he grew up with in Lithuania that he's like learned there, that someone sort of apply these connector skills into a lead guard role in college and still be good enough to clearly be a one and done. Not that many examples. I mentioned Lonzo earlier, and Lonzo, again, that UCLA offense is sort of like a historic outlier in terms of style of play and everything like that. It's hard to really compare that to anything. But when, like, Reed last year, I mentioned him as well. He played like a connector in that offense. Like he was a connector in that Kentucky offense. Only in a handful of games was he sort of cast in a more lead guard role. And it seemed like he really preferred to connect. And so that's why I always thought in his NBA projection, his off-ball utility should be really at the top of the list of how a team intended to use him, because I didn't think that you could all of a sudden tell him go have 25 usage on an NBA floor, because I didn't think he'd be comfortable doing it.
mhm.
Kasparis is a little bit different. He has the usage, but this skill set with sort of the lack of top athleticism or sort of acrobatics with the ball in his hands would imply that he's going to be some sort of a connector. If you wanted to draw him to a previous Illinois guard who then transferred out but made the NBA, Brandon Podchemsky, similar sort of high feel kid, he's probably a bit smaller than Kasparis. He entered the league at an older age. He certainly didn't have the 18-year-old production that Kasparas has. That's why he transferred out of Illinois. But like good rebounder, good passer, good shooter. I think Kasparas is probably a little better in every category. But
Mhm.
it's if Kasparas is sort of like a juiced up version of Podchemsky, that is like a cool player to think about. But there's also a situation like a just a basic sort of roster crunch situation that Kasparas is going to run into, where even though he has good size, I think it's going to be difficult for him to thrive, like to help drive his team towards winning, if he is not the smallest player on the floor for his side. If he plays with another guard smaller than he, there's going to be a very quickly, as you run into teams that really have positional size everywhere, it's going to be really, really hard. There's really only one team with sort of a smallish backcourt in the NBA that is a contender this year. Now, they are arguably a title favorite because they're the Cleveland Cavaliers, and they have Evan Mobley and Jared Allen in the front court. And Donovan Mitchell, who is sort of the undersized two, is this absolute athletic, like freak
Mhm.
marvel. So like when I think about what Kasparas can do as a connector, usually if you're casting a connector, you're casting him sort of off the ball a lot, playing off of other really good talent a lot. And I just want to know from you if you think that in that role, he can help drive the team to a lot of wins if there's another guard on the floor? Or do you agree with me that he kind of needs to be the smallest guy, which doesn't always mean lead initiator? You could play off of
Mhm.
Paolo Banchero and not be a lead
Mhm. Mhm.
initiator as a guard.
I think he definitely fits the latter, what you're talking about, which I think is speaks to where modern basketball is going in terms of positional size. I think when you look at the next couple draft classes, with guys like Darren Peterson, that are clear guys that you're going to need to give the ball to, that are not lead guards, you know what I mean, but exhibit some of these game breaking traits that we throw on a player like an Anthony Edwards, where it's like, again, 6'5", not 6'5", 6'6", not really a lead guard, but again is like just game breaker. Um, with Kasparis, I think he's always going to be best paired next to one of those guys. And I think when you're looking at this draft class, I think when you look at the top three players, that's what you're looking at. I think you're looking at three really, really strong sidekicks to guys that are in the next draft class. If you're looking at teams that are, trying to build, franchise out of these next couple classes, like some the teams in the league are kind of at in their franchise development. I think when you look at Kasparas, he exhibits all of the best qualities of a connector in terms of what you're looking for if you're looking at modern guards. In terms of like guys like Alex Caruso, guys like Derek White, guys like Drew Holiday, guys that are on the winning teams in basketball. You look at Isaiah Joe, most of these guys that are on the Oklahoma City Thunder in terms of their guards, or wing players. You look across the board, you see 6'5", 6'6". Even Shea is an unbelievable athlete, but is obviously has a different level of advantage creation than we're trying to project onto Kasparas. But I think that there is still a lot of validity in trying to cast Kasparas into a major role on a team where he can be that guy who sets the table and also is, some of those guys obviously clear him defensively or athletically in certain areas. But I think that, there's spots where he does really, really well as a shooter and playmaker where he clears a lot of those guys in some of those areas that I just mentioned. So there is like a space where I think that if you're looking for an offensive oriented, connecting guard that's going to probably play your lead guard spot and guard point guards for the most part, or twos or threes, whoever the slowest player on the court is. Um, is kind of my take on it. I mean, I think this is the guy, and I don't think you're gonna have a problem with him, boxing out or trying to figure out great positioning to stop the, wing role players that pop up in the NBA because shooting's so important. And the NBA season's long, man. 82 games. You're not always gonna face the best five-man combos from every team in the NBA, every given night. And we see that. guys like Zach Edey are able to, even though just by doing the little stuff and, he's not putting up 40 points per game like he was in college basketball, he's still got the highest BPM of any rookie in a 15 game stretch in NBA history. Screening, timely passing, smart cuts, well executed positioning are all really, really important things to basketball that don't often get talked about because they don't show up on the stat sheet and they also don't show up on the highlight reel very often. And major media networks are definitely not going to cover Steven Adams, screen creation on offense like some of us sickos are.
Well, I want to come back to Kasparas a little bit later in
Mhm.
discussing Harper, but let's move on to Harper because you
Yeah.
mentioned that you thought he was a sidekick as well. I want to explore that. So
Yeah.
Dylan Harper, about 23, 5, and 5. And he's playing for Rutgers, where his brother played, Ron Harper Jr.,
Hmm.
New Jersey kid, because they're both sons of Ron Harper, the former Knicks guard. Uh, his splits are 53% from the field, 37% from three, 75% from the line. We mentioned Dylan a little bit with his downhill talent already. I'll just say my very quick 2 cents on Dylan as sort of an overview is a really, really gifted downhill driver and finisher. He is a lefty with a very advanced off right hand, particularly with his handle, but also really good finishing. I mean, his rim numbers, let me double check what I got here. He is at let's see. Dylan Harper is shooting 76% at the rim, which is usually a number that you see like power forwards and centers, shoot that kind of percentage at the rim. Really just sort of out of this world for a
Hmm.
lead guard, perimeter, outside in player to finish that well at the hoop. He also has a very, very healthy free throw rate, as does Kasparas. But like I said, he's more of that mistake causer
Hmm.
where like you can't really contain him going downhill when he gets to the rim. And when he is going downhill, I think that he's a very good passer on the move out of the gravity that he's sort of caused from the defense, out of the defensive movement that he's initiated. However, he also is not quite an above the rim athlete. He's 6'6, 210, 215, and 18 years old. So he's a horse, but
Hmm.
he does not sort of detonate off the ground. Nor do I think does he have really sudden twitchy movements creating space behind him, like for a step back or side to side. He has a very tight handle and he can get his shot off, but it isn't sort of this omnidirectional twitch that you see sort of the best guard athletes have. You couple that with the fact that his jumper, which he has decent touch on, I mean, probably better than decent touch on, but his jumper is a shot form that sort of pushes out. Not a
Hmm.
very high release, and he doesn't jump very high off the ground when he shoots it. And when I see him, his scoring package, when he goes to that stuff, when he does a turnaround jumper in the mid range or whatever, or when he tries to do a step back three, he's not generating a ton of space. And those looks often are ending up more contested, which sort of takes away from this idea that he can be whatever, a primary high scoring initiator. However, sidekick, as the term you used, can mean lots of different things. You could still, Franz Wagner is, I guess, a sidekick, so to speak. And you saw what happened when Paolo exited the lineup earlier this year and Franz went crazy. You can score 20 to 25 a night efficiently and still be a
Hmm.
quote unquote sidekick. So
Hmm.
I guess
On the
I
best teams, that's what they need to be.
that's what I'm saying. And the question is sort of who is more scalable given their role up to a great team in
Mhm.
sort of Kasparis versus Dylan. So I want to know what sort of, if you see him as sort of a second scorer, if you see Dylan as sort of a second scorer on a team, what
Hmm.
sort of second scorer do you believe he can be? Or do you believe his role is different from that?
Yeah. I mean, comparatively, the stuff that immediately pops to me on his tape is just how different his finishing is to Kasparis. Like, I mean, you talked about percentages. Kasparis is pretty respectable in his own right,
Yes,
at
he is.
64%, 64% at the rim.
which is
You
very
got
good for a guard, by the way. Like Tyrese
yeah,
Maxey, who's considered this insane finisher, I believe was 65 at Kentucky his year. So
both
yeah,
guys, and I think it boils down to we're talking about very refined basketball players at 18 years old. Um, some of Dylan Harper's stuff that he's able to do off of contact in the paint, off of 2 feet in the paint, is just much more advanced than Kasparas. And I think that that's where we definitely see like a separation, not only in the numbers, slightly, but definitely in the eye test and confidence, which we see from some of the increased volume on Dylan Harper's driving. Um, in terms of a scorer, how I project him long term is kind of like you said. It's tough to project his shot to be good enough, in my opinion, in terms of like the 3-point shot and a pull up mid range. I don't think his touch is ever going to be like a Shea Gilgeous-Alexander or somebody that's, you
no,
know, dissecting you in isolation. And I don't think his handle, although tight, like you said, um, similar to Kasparis with some of my gripes in terms of where I'm falling on these guys, eval wise, broad, like, draft history wise. And why, kind of dub these guys more like this is more of like a sidekick tier draft where, I even dubbed the last year, and I mean, I had Alex Sarr #1. I thought it was a role player draft, straight up. Just it's a role player draft. You know what I mean? And there's great role players in there. And I think, to further clarify on the term sidekick, a guy like Dylan Harper, has more than displayed that he's capable of being a initiator. And I think that he's going to be able to step on to an NBA court and continue that role like you're talking about. Um, but where it gets tough to project him as like a superstar is the stuff where I stop with Kasparis in terms of trying to project him to be a superstar is like, like you said, these guys that are bona fide, no doubt home run picks are elite athletes 9 times out of 10, unless they're a Luka or a Jokic. Or I mean, it's very far and few between where a guy is so good at all these other areas where he's able to just completely almost ignore the athletic aspect of the game in terms of how important having superiority is. And I think both these guys are great examples of like, Dylan Harper is really a dog on defense. His defense, pre-draft stuff was something that really placed him in high regards to me in terms of like how he projects long term as an NBA guard. Me, I'm not as and that's why I look at like, the big board ranking of them being 1, 2, 3 with obviously Flag being the third is, being more arbitrary because I think that it really does depend on fit. And if you're looking for a guy that, you're relying on more of a like leaning on, that on ball usage in terms of defense and offense, then, Dylan Harper is definitely the guy to go. But if you're trying to already improve a team that's already got young budding stars and stuff like that, a guy like Dylan Harper in terms of his 3-point projection, I don't know where he fits in terms of like if he doesn't turn out to be like a 37, 38% shooter when he takes a couple steps back next year. Um, I don't know where his stock looks like. I mean, when we look at like a lot of these elite rim pressure guards like he's been able to project himself to be, and the guys that aren't good at shooting, it's a really short, you know what I mean? It's a really short list of the guys that are super successful. You know what I mean? And those
are
guys
you
that are
but who's in your head when you think about that in terms
um,
of elite rim pressure guys, but sort of shaky jumpers coming out? Like, that's what you're talking about, right?
yeah, I mean, I think of definitely like, the guys that are like super athletic, like the Roses, the Westbrooks, the Morants. But I think even when you get to guys that aren't even in that tier of athlete, maybe even the tier below, like Markel Fultz is a phenomenal athlete, but I'm not going to compare him to John Moran or Derrick Rose. I think it'd be
Mm-hmm.
crazy to do that. But Markel Fultz is definitely, and even if you take a tier off his athleticism, he was still a phenomenal touch finisher and able to do a lot below the rim. Um, but when the shooting doesn't quite pan out, and that's not like a role that you can project him into, especially as we move towards the modern NBA, it gets pretty shaky. Um, Shea is a guy where it's like, he's had to have that mid-range jumper to get that type of respect. So he can get to these drives and have these elegant moves and be able to get that space and create those mistakes. I think college basketball wise, like Dylan Harper's able, like, like you said, he's built like an ox. Like college basketball guards aren't really able to fend him off when he's trying to get a certain direction, especially
Hmm.
guys that are underclassmen. Like when he sees the bench guard come off for some of these other teams in this non-conference schedule, he's eating them alive. Like
Right.
just rely, like he'll just go at him 3 or 4 possessions straight. And I mean you'll see a bit of that from Ace too. And you know it's something the Rutgers coaching staff is telling him to do is like when the kids come in that stink on the other teams, like just blow this team out the door water. You know what I mean? And that's a fine strategy to take in college basketball, but I'm again gonna be curious to see how him and Kasparas do can down the stretch in terms of when we get to March. I think Rutgers will be a little shaky, but Illinois will probably be in March Madness. Um, and I think when we see Kasparas again show up in some of these big moments, it'll be interesting to see like if we get any of these spots where we've been able to get from Dylan Harper in terms of that mistake creating like you're asking for. Because I still don't even think that we've gotten as much of Dylan Harper to project him into a number one role. And I think that's what you're trying to get at too.
Well, that's what it's
Hmm.
what I'm trying to figure out when
Hmm.
I watch him. Like you mentioned, like it's a great idea to say, when sort of the weak link on the other team comes on the floor, you just pick at him and
Hmm.
blow him away. But Rutgers isn't really like winning. I mean, they're beating,
Hmm.
the Merrimacks and the Monmouths and, their New Jersey brethren. Those teams they're beating, but every time they've had it, like a real, I mean, I don't want to say every time. They beat Notre Dame, they beat Penn State. Like those are real legitimate wins. They escaped Seton Hall because of a buzzer beater that Dylan hit. But lost to Alabama in a tight game that they had a chance to win, lost to A&M when they were sort of up with 3 minutes left and then sort of went very, very cold, including one or two turnovers from Dylan. Lost at Ohio State. You know, they we can get into Ace Bailey in a little while as to, why Rutgers, like some of the problems Rutgers is having. Although I think the bigger problem has to do with the talent around Dylan and Ace rather than Ace, even though I think Ace is caught from some flack for, assist to turnover ratio and things like that.
Hmm.
But there is part of me, even though it's probably a bias, there is part of me that's just like, well, if Dylan was really like this true blue top two, top three pick kind of guy, he'd be doing a little bit better in driving this winning in terms of being an unstoppable force sort of down the stretch in these tight games. And I think that I think his feel in general is good. Again, this is an 18-year-old kid in like a really,
Hmm.
really high usage role. And college basketball has older, better players in it than it did 10 years ago because of NIL. So understanding all of that as well, it's I see him as someone who almost despite being such a high usage guy, I think he defers to his teammates maybe a little too much in some of these situations if winning every game is his goal. But I also think that the lack of solutions besides going downhill for him to
Hmm.
score does make him someone that you can sort of wall up against and just force anyone else to try to make a play on that Rutgers team. And so when I think about him as a pro, like you're mentioning, you're having trouble projecting him a little bit if he's not this, 20 to 25 point a game guy. I think that's a really valid concern to have. I think if because his mid-range numbers are not good, and that goes to, his sort of lack of counters. I think he's a guy who could become a really good, I guess, 8 to 15 foot player in the NBA if he really leans into playing off 2 feet in the paint because he's going to be really strong. He'll be able to carve out space that way. And if he gets a jumper with a bit higher of a release point, that can be a real money area for him if he
Hmm.
wants to really up that scoring total. I think as a defender, I think he's good. Like he has size and he's competitive, and so for college that makes him a solid enough defender. But at the NBA level again, when you look at the really good teams and the sort of athletes they have defending on the perimeter for, their smallest team member in a five-man unit, those athletes are usually a bit twitchier than Dylan is as well. And
Mhm.
so it's another kind of subtle role question. I think most people look at the physical downhill ability, the ability to cause the defense to react, and they go, I'd rather really bet on that and see where that goes and see where this kid is at age 23, 24, 25, and how easily he can get his buckets.
Mhm.
When if in comparing him to Kasparas. And I
Yeah.
might lean that way too, in terms of that specific bankable NBA skill. Where I have not made up my mind is whether or not that skill is going to increasingly become a specialty in a league that is going to be as athletic as the NBA is going to be for the next 10 years. Is that going to be a skill that almost is better suited for like a bench player or sort of a regular season minutes filler? I don't want to say
Mhm.
specialist that much,
But I
but you
mean,
know what
that's
I
what I was
mean.
talking about with Ace Bailey and Trey Johnson, where you're talking about some of these guys that project into that type of stuff long term.
Mhm.
Where I think where with Kasparas, it helps your qualms of that stuff. Where when he doesn't show up scoring wise and it's not going on, he does not force the issue at all. Will in fact just completely go to what works. Or just figure out a spot where he can contribute. Either it's sitting in the corner, setting a screen, just being a presentable option. When you look at tonight, I haven't gotten to look at the film, but I mean, Rutgers played Wisconsin tonight, lost. Um, and Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey, when their shots aren't going, they generally, you know, haven't done stuff. More Ace Bailey. This is like the first really atrocious Dylan Harper game I've seen box score wise.
Mhm.
I obviously haven't watched it. He only played 15 minutes, so knock on one, hope he's healthy.
Coming
I
off an injury too, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see any news break they re-aggravated anything. But coming off the injury, we'll see how he looks in a couple weeks, but it is something that I do want to agree with, and I don't want to knock him for, coming back from being hurt, but when he's not able to get his shots going, it is hard to see that drive and push downhill from him, like you're saying, where it's like he doesn't where Kasparas has willed Illinois to a couple wins late in the game. I think Dylan's had moments that have won them games, you know what I mean? But I don't think that if his shot isn't going, I can't see him being a guy that goes and makes eight or nine strings of plays on both ends, including great playmaking opportunities that aren't fueled also by scoring. More of a roundabout way of saying that I think when he's scoring well, his playmaking looks even better, which is kind of makes common sense. But I think it's really something that's big with him, where I've seen, especially in the pick and roll, is a lot of his, when he's most dominant driving, is able to pick apart a lot of those mismatches. He tends to have good playmaking games too. Whereas when he's not able to pick apart those mismatches driving, he doesn't always have those great playmaking performances like I've seen from guys I know can actually fill the connector or initiator role like an Igor Demon or Kasparas at the top of this class for me. That's where those guys get that edge because I think that's a more important specialty in my eyes value as a scout slash coach in terms of the long-term view of the NBA. I think it's going to be much more important to have at least two guys on your roster that can come in, knock down an open three. And then also, if your star player, your second best player is out, if you have a pretty good team and Kasparas is your third best guy or whatever, you know, how I kind of project and see, where he fits in a franchise long term if I were building it. Um, maybe not second and third in terms of most skill, but most raw talent, objectable talent or whatever, scoring potential, however you want to phrase it. Um, I think that he has that stability, you know what I mean, in that frame of that connector prospect, where that is still going to be really valuable in a couple years. If you look at the Thunder, what they've continually stocked up on as they've, are turning the corner on continually to improve as a franchise and figure out where their footing is and how they're going to take the reins of the NBA because the talent and assets are there. Um, you know, the Spurs too, to some extent, continuing to stockpile on guys that have decent positional size, and exhibit some of these just like basic like understanding of how the game of basketball is supposed to be played on offense. And I think when you have more of those guys on the floor, like it's really beneficial. And then when they can get their own shot and finish well at the rim off cuts, handoffs, any sort of, action you want to run, it gets really fun. And I think Harper doesn't do as much of like the coming off the handoff and like what I mean, and going and taking a guy off the dribble and getting a shot in the mid range. Like you said, he doesn't do any of that stuff, which is like a pretty common thing that I see like some of the best like volume scorers in the NBA do, like unless they're a lead guard, like we're talking about, like the Shays, you know what I mean? Bookers, Durant's, all these guys that, I really think that are like some of the purest and best scorers, they're able to score off, the handoff and curl cuts and stuff like that in the mid range.
Well, here's the thing. I think, if
Or
I'm
like a
trying
Dylan.
to compare Dylan to any one of these like mega scores that you're mentioning,
Hmm.
the one that I would go to is Brunson. As another guy who did not in college have like the quickest trigger on his three, got enough of them up, but there was like a question even early in his NBA career of how many of those off the dribble he was ultimately going to shoot. That had more to do with his size than it did his shooting form, but also like not an above the rim athlete. But what Brunson, Brunson had a more advanced mid-range bag, obviously, than just about anybody, Dylan Harper included as a freshman. Brunson also stayed 3 years at Villanova. But where he's been able to make his leap is that he's very comfortable in that 8 to 15 foot area, and he can make himself a threat through strength and footwork and touch so that if there is a defender who's quote unquote in position, he is still very comfortable. And that's sort of, it is maybe wishing upon a star to think that Ron could take a similar leap, but I think the possibility at least exists given his finishing touch, because his finishing touch is ridiculous. And you want to bet that that touch can translate to other areas of the floor besides just the rim. And I think
Hmm.
with Kasparas, when you talk about, I mean, when you mention the Thunder, the guys they've invested in, Dort, Caruso, Case and Wallace with a top 10 pick in the 2023 draft. These guys are all defensively tilted. Like, yes,
Hmm.
they have Isaiah Joe, but he's more of an off-ball shooting specialist who can occasionally attack a closeout. Also not a high minute guy for them, really. And they have Aaron Wiggins, who arguably is also defensively tilted and also has more size than a guy like Kasparis does. If you are thinking about Steph Castle, I mean, opinions can vary on Steph Castle's future. Mine, at least, is probably a little less rosy than others are. But he is defensively tilted in San Antonio. And I've harped on this
Hmm.
podcast a lot that where I think sort of the modern supporting guard role is going is towards those defensively tilted guys. I agree with you that at the college level, Kasparis is better at not forcing the issue, but not forcing the issue at the NBA level as a supporting player is code for passing the ball. And unless you are one of the very top passers in the world, that pass usually has the effect of letting the defense reset and catch up to you. That means that you're passing up a shot because you're not quite athletic enough to get it off. And like, I'm not saying that there aren't solutions around that. I'm saying that if Kasparas is not going to be an incredible defensive player, and I don't think he's going to be an incredible
Hmm.
defensive player, he might be able to hold his own, but that's why I brought up again Podchemsky as more of this offensively tilted connector piece. Then I think his discernment in when to shoot and when not to shoot is maybe not as valuable at the NBA level when there is one of these switchblades, as I call them, defensively tilted connector pieces on just about every team, providing their version of value. So if you're going to bet on one of these guys, and like this is just me talking my way through it because I don't really
Hmm.
know who I prefer right now. I can understand why most lean with Dylan because even if you only have a less than 10% chance that Dylan's going to get to sort of a Jalen Brunson-ish universe as an all-court scorer, you would rather almost take the shot on that, knowing that at the very least you're going to have like a bear of a sixth man for other teams to deal with coming downhill and finishing at the rim with NBA space. I can appreciate that line of argument. It's
Mhm.
just I think the concerns you bring up with him are very legitimate though. It's why it makes it a really knotty question between these two guys. If most people agree with us that number one option is kind of distant for both of them, you know?
100%. And I think that we're both definitely on the right track of where we're asking our questions. I'm asking where is the limit on how offensively focused that role can be. And I think Kasparas is one of those guys who can potentially develop into those one of those tier one passers. Especially from a field perspective, I've seen a lot of just incredible reads from him, and incredible delivery angles. So some of that stuff is there where we could see that development. Do I think he's as good as like a guy like who are some of my favorite playmakers like Lonzo Ball? No, I don't think he's like a generational guy. So I don't know if there's like, again with Ball, there's the defensive stuff. Where he showed, if we're talking about UCLA Lonzo Ball, not the Lonzo Ball obviously we currently know now, post couple of knee surgeries, but I mean, that guy was a freak athletically too. And it makes it tough when you're trying to think about how to value that playmaking stuff and where I'm trying to value it. And I think it'll definitely be like more of a trial and error pick. And I think we'll have to see if he's because how he's been scoring and with the efficiency at the rim, I find it tough to like knock him down. You know what I mean? From where he's
It
at right
is.
now.
That's what's so interesting is that he's this
Mhm.
connector skill set in a
And
lead
there's
guard role
the fish
producing.
and the stuff that's irritating the most, Chuck, is like is because I'm able to make that argument with you with the query of like a synergy query, which nobody has. Nobody can do those. Only yours truly. And go and tell you like he's on that efficiency tier of like a Frank Kaminsky, Zion Williamson, Spencer Dinwiddie, like a top tier college basketball player, like in a premier like star player. Like all three of those guys were their program piece in terms of like Zion definitely maybe didn't have the
Well, and that query is
load
not
or
just as freshman. When you talk about Kaminsky, you're talking about Kaminsky like as a senior when
yeah,
Wisconsin was going to
that's
the Final
senior
Four.
and Spencer
Right.
Dinwiddie pre-draft year.
Right.
I'm pretty sure
Right.
he was a sophomore or junior. I
Well,
don't
he also, I think, hurt his knee.
yeah.
I don't, I mean, yeah, I think he
Yeah.
was an older guy. I'd
So
have to
I
go
mean, it's
back and check.
and so that's like the tier of production, what I mean, production efficiencies, and in terms of like these play types, which makes it like tough for me. And I think some of it does fall on like, where do we see the league going? And it makes it tough for me to say like, oh, these guys can't be my top three picks because they're not superstars. When it's like when I look down the rest of the class, I have way more gripes with a lot of these other guys. You know what I mean? Like I could talk, what I mean? We've talked about Caspers for probably about an hour. And I mean, I could talk about my problems with most of these guys for 2 hours. You know what I mean? We could sit and like I've seen Hugo Gonzalez still in people's top 20s, and I love Hugo, but there's some real stuff that we have to talk about there if you want me looking at your board with him on there. So that's where I'm at on some of these guys where like, I've washed away a lot of these guys that I'm, and I come from definitely that camp of people that are very like overzealous with projection. I come from the Pokuševski dreamers, the Caboclos 2 years away, 2 years away type of camp of thinking in terms of where I put my positivity in prospects. It's all the way to the
Hmm.
max. But I have tampered a lot of that down, and it does leave me with this class feeling like I think I'm on the right track in terms of I think a couple of these maybe Kasparas is the teaching moment for me in terms of like we really have to bet on athleticism and defense at the top when we're looking at guards like you're talking about. Um,
I'll say it with one exception though, and
Mhm.
this is not going to be fair to Kasparis, but if we want to make a real top of the draft bet with him, you have to. You mentioned way seems like 3 hours ago. You mentioned his catch and shoot numbers, and you basically expected them to regress positively, which I would agree with, given his touch indicators everywhere else on the floor. If he is not asked in, Illinois doesn't draw up a lot of off ball sets for him to spring him loose for catch and shoot looks or relocation looks or like outright movement looks from three. They don't try to weaponize his gravity as an off-ball piece.
Mhm.
If we're imagining a version of him that is returning real top of draft value, it's in a team like, because we know he's not going to be an elite athlete. It's going to be a team that balances his on ball and connected decision making with off ball gravity. That's the only way I can really see it happening for him. And if he comes into the NBA and is a 19-year-old kid, he has legit off-ball gravity, because an NBA team will use that for him, absolutely, because the ball will be in some superstar's hand anyway, unless maybe it's the Brooklyn Nets. But everyone else, there's someone using that usage up. If if it's there, because I haven't said this about Kasparas yet in this episode, but this kid has as quick and as lethal of a pull-up trigger as like I've seen in a prospect since I've been
Mhm.
doing this. I
He's
mean,
got great instinct.
it is incredible. So if his relocation movement shooting is there like from the jump
One.
and from the get-go, then you can more easily see him being the smallest player on his team, at 6'5" in a starting lineup. You could see him providing that extra dimension pardon me, offensive value, to where maybe he is a real viable like number two scoring option and
Mhm.
like maybe number one playmaking option or something like that. And the only other, I mean, the real extreme example of this is Steph Curry, which is unfair again to compare
Mhm.
Kasparas to. But like that is at least a model for how that player operates. And I think at times you see the Cavs use Darius Garland this way. I mentioned Mitchell and contrasting what Kasparas isn't earlier. But you see them use Garland off the ball a little bit because again they have Mitchell and they have bigs who are really really good passers and screeners. Um, I think that kind of a role for Kasparas is possible. It's narrow, man. You need
Mhm.
like it is a narrow lane to fill to be
And to give you an
that
idea,
good on and off the ball. It's just,
and
but it's possible.
And
That's
to give you
that's
an
all I'm
idea
saying.
of like the only time that you can see on his like, stat record of where you can really point to a time where like he had that role and you can look for evidence or results is you have to go to 2020, at least from my availability, you go to 2022 U16 Lithuania. And he was much more at that point was much more of an off-ball player. It's the only season that he has on synergy with those Lithuania teams, where his usage in the pick and roll is lower than spot up. So he's definitely much more of a spot up off ball player.
Hmm.
And you see his catch and shoot percentages at 44%.
Yeah,
Um so
doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
it's a clear change that once he moved from when the Lithuania program was like, okay, this is one of our better guards, not then from being one of our like better and more utilized off ball players. It's clear that there was a little bit of a regression in terms of that like catch and shoot stuff. And I think that when you see him play, especially this last summer, you see him play very, very freely in terms of like the movement off the ball. I think Illinois, like I said, is a little bit more stagnant. You see him play with guards like Kylan Boswell, where
Hmm.
yes, we want to project Kylan the best way possible because he's a super underappreciated guard.
I like
Um,
Kylan a lot.
I
Yeah.
I mean, I love his game. Shout out Logan Adams. He took him in a mock draft that we did last year, and I thought it was a great pick. Like in terms of fit, he took him with Minnesota. And even though maybe that doesn't look like the best thing now, taking him first round, obviously not necessarily a prospect this year. Still, like again, like you can't play him necessarily next to a guard like that in the NBA. So I don't think that there's gonna be these moments where he has these like tough spots where instead he's going to get that type of attention from a team in terms of getting him off the ball and trying to utilize his quick release and his instincts. And I think he has good natural relocation skills. It was one of the things that impressed me the most. Like I said at the top about his experience with Lithuania last summer, playing next to Paulius Mrazkis, who's, if you know anything about me, he's been one of my favorite darts in terms of a guy just to watch develop as a college basketball player who's going to be, in 2 years, I think will be a player of the year candidate. I'll say it right here. Paulius is tough, and he showed off incredible on-ball skill at 6'9" for Lithuania. And Kasparas fit right in off the ball and then was able to take charge in those moments when he needed to initiate. And I think that's not the role you see him in at Illinois now, and I think it can be tough to like project like a 30% catch and shoot shooter into being an elite connector and elite enough to take him top 5 overall. But when you put the whole body of work together and you look at like the different type of advantage creation that players like a Steph Curry can present with their gravity and nonstop movement, that's mistake creating. You know what I mean?
Of
With something,
course.
and I think that stuff is generally under repped in draft classes because we don't have to dig that far necessarily to find like things that can drive a guy's argument into like a premier spot. You know what I mean? Generally, the cases can be made easier. The guy's 7'4" and he can dribble and shoot and block shots like nobody else before. He's got 8 foot wingspan. Yeah, that's an easy number one overall pick argument. And 7'1" with a strong wingspan, strong athleticism, a button jump shot. Like that's a easy number one overall argument to make. I think that when you have to dive into a guy's U16 tape to find reason to believe, it can be tough to convince people. And that's why I'm still doubting myself, but he hasn't given me any reason to doubt him at all, man. It's been
Well, to name a couple more guys in the league, and it's unfortunate because Kasparas is white and both these guys are white, but whatever. At
Mhm.
least I mentioned Darius Garland. I think an offensively tilted connector, for example, like the type that I'm saying is sort of there's a shrinking alleyway. Like the walls are closing in on these kinds of guys, but they can still exist and provide a lot of value. One is like Dante DiVincenzo, who again last year exploded into this incredibly high usage efficient 3-point shooter, mostly off the ball. Who now Minnesota finally started tonight. I've been waiting all year for them to do that, and they beat the Clippers. But he is a guy who's probably a more explosive vertical athlete than Kasparas, but never had Kasparas' sort of on-ball usage or
Mhm.
playmaking. Someone who is less athletic than DiVincenzo, but had the on-ball experience before entering the league is Austin Reeves, who now the Lakers have sort of anointed, all but anointed, as their starting point guard. And
Mhm.
someone who also had a breakdown over the course of his college career between catch and shoot numbers and on ball numbers, depending on his role. Because he started in Wichita State and was an off-ball player, and I think was in like the 99th percentile of catch and shoot efficiency, ends up at Oklahoma, is on the ball, and his overall 3-point percentage, goes down to around 30% because his usage was so out of control. And if you
Mhm.
compare Kasparas to a guy like Reeves, Kasparas has already sort of gone through that process, is on the ball as a freshman in a high major situation, and is still killing it. And Reeves is a good player. Like if I were to tell you that this guy is sort of blue chip Reeves, you would say, "Oh, I mean, I guess that is like a top 5 pick." So like there are ways for it to work. I know I feel like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth, but
That's
it's
part of scouting,
just
man.
what's up.
That's part of scouting.
Well, no, I know. But like it's just it is I find sort of Yakushonis the more sort of invigorating player to think through different possibilities for, but I also don't want to mistake that for, well, that means I'm going to be higher on him because he's sort of more fun to think about. I
Hmm.
don't know. It might be that Harper, that downhill stuff with the floor that it provides, is the better thing to bet on. But Yakushonis, like there is something about him that I cannot shake. That like all these other examples are just older guys generally than he was. That
Hmm.
it is very prodigious production, and I want
Hmm.
to make sure that we say that. I also, unfortunately, don't think we're going to be able to get to Derek Queen, but I can have you back for a part two. But let's go to Ace
Down.
since we mentioned Dylan already.
Yeah, I'm totally down for a part two. And to cap off the Jakucionis conversation, um, it definitely is like a scout's conundrum, and I don't think that's why boards should never be ever considered finished products. You know what I mean? Until the picks are made, You should never be done editing your board and trying to think through stuff at any level, whether it's like simple, critical, whatever. Like, and he's definitely a guy who like shot up my board like pretty quickly. I think once I started just to see the level of consistency like you're talking about of this prestigious um like just production. I mean, the points per possession numbers are absurd. I mean, we could have touched more on, how great Don Harper's been scoring in the pick and roll. There's
Really good. Look,
yeah, great.
you cannot contain him going downhill unless you completely wall
These
up.
are these are two really, really good guard prospects, and I think that our conversation definitely has done them justice. And I think that the fact that Jakucionis is such a conundrum and shows in the fact that he's able to bleed his way into any conversation you really have, because it's really about what you value at the core of basketball in terms of like, where the game is changing. It appears all the time like offense is the only thing that matters, but when you check on prospects defense, it can really be something that starts to make or break, and even in the athleticism department. So it's an interesting combo, and I think Ace is even more interesting in some ways.
Well, let's talk about him then.
Mhm.
I mean, Ace is someone who, you know, 15 years ago probably would go in the top three without a second thought. He has been mocked in the top three. He's probably still mocked in the top three after this performance against Indiana, where he had 4 blocks and a steal and 39 points. So, and he's younger than both Yakushonis and Dylan Harper. He's not going to be 19, I think, probably until after Summer League. So he, as Harper's teammate at Rutgers, as part of this heralded class, is averaging about 20 points, just under 8 rebounds, but his splits are, let's see, 49% from the field, 35% from three, and somehow 58% from the line, which I don't really know how to make heads or tails
Hey,
of.
but 54.5% on mid-range jump
Well, yeah,
shots.
I'm getting to that. I'm getting to that. I'm just talking about
It's just
how
like
how
it's
ridiculous it is that a
so
guy
dumb.
whose profile is as a shot maker, a tough shot taker, a tough shot maker at 6'8" or 6'9", whatever he is somehow shooting 58% from the line on 4 free throws a game. Certainly doesn't do wonders for my projection of him as like an elite NBA shooter. But Ace is caught in flack, or cotton, what am I saying? He has caught flack for basically never having a game where he looks like he is making the ball pop as a connective player off of Dylan Harper. And I don't think it's any sort of selfishness on Ace's part. To the contrary, I think Ace is like a high effort defender who projects pretty well as a wing defender to the next level. Not all defense or anything, but competitive, high effort. And he's like a pretty decent rebounder. His motor runs relatively hot, in my opinion. It's just that when he is so used, like it is so ingrained in his style of play and in his approach to be a scorer. And unfortunately, the way he goes about scoring is to stop the ball and size up his defender. And if that's your approach, then you better create separation very, very quickly. And Ace doesn't really do that. He gets off the ground very quickly and he has a high release point so he can get his shot off. But he is a tough shot maker because tough shots tend to be the only shots that he can really generate for himself. And it might be easier if he accepted a role where he like, or maybe if Rutgers design looks for him where he caught the ball on the move and just went downhill and just allowed his length to finish at the rim, gin up some layup looks like that. But absent that sort of stuff from a self-created perspective, his looks are tough, really tough. And that's hard to bank a really high pick on. But you still really like him as a top 10 player. So talk to me what your theory is of Ace and how you think he thrives at the next level, like likely playing off of better talent on the wing in terms of like being, maybe a number 3, number 4 scoring option.
Yeah, and I mean, like I mentioned, kind of with my tiers in this class, like I've, a tier one, which has 4 players that I kind of view as what I would consider excellent evals where they exhibit phenomenal traits. And then I have another tier where, Derek Queen leads the way right now. And then it's, some more of like swingy-ish prospects with Edgecombe and Malik. And then I have Ace sitting at 8. And kind of where I've fallen on that is, I'm a big believer in pedigree, and we've talked about how kind of that plays out over time. And somebody with Ace's athletic pedigree, and also just shot making and scoring pedigree is tough to take out of your top 10. I think if you were to do a one-on-one tournament of all the players in the draft class, I think Ace would probably finish, in the top 4 players. I don't think many people have that type of one-on-one size, ability, shot making that he does. And if it's a day where he's on, he wins the whole thing and probably beats everybody pretty handedly. Even down to like Cooper Flag. I mean, we can remember in high school, Cooper Flag was, he got given business by AJ and Ace, and Cam Boozer and all these guys that are these
Hmm.
big wings that, Ace obviously doesn't maybe have the handle or the polish that we're looking at with a Cam Boozer, a Peterson, or a Devonsa for next year, but we're still, I think Devonsa and him are a little bit maybe closer in terms of where they're at. But when like projecting his NBA role, I think obviously the thing that needs to be addressed from the jump is that when you look at guys that, especially guys that you can even track me as liking with the GG Jackson, a Cam Whitmore, some of these guys where the knock is no playmaking, guys a chucker, guys this, guys that. The thing that I return on both those guys with, and where with Ace maybe it's a little different, where he hasn't necessarily fallen and skyrocketed down boards like both those guys did.
Hmm.
Cam and Gigi are both top 10 recruits. So they were top 5, respective conversations for most, I think, for a good clump of people in that class. Especially outside looking in, but that was a stacked class. Looking back on it, geez, the last couple ones we've evaluated. Um, but yeah, I think it falls into that group of where you look at where Gigi has succeeded from the jump is it's clear that Gigi's buying into being an off-ball player and buying into developing that off-ball shooting.
Hmm.
I think that where that development gets tough and where I have to have people halt a little bit on like he can just be kind of like an MPJ. Like, okay, if he's just a big shooter, like he can just be like MPJ. And I think some of the stuff that you have to return to is if you go look at MPJ at even Missouri, he's not taking these mid-range jump shots. Like he's always been a guy who's honed in on the more like people will call it more of like a Jason Tatum style of wing scoring where it's layups
Hmm.
and dunks and threes.
Hmm.
Um, and I think Ace presents quite a conundrum. But we talked about it with Harper and Kasparas in terms of a gripe. He presents that type of scoring that it tends to get hated on a little bit and undervalued, overvalued from year to year, depending on the player you're talking about with that in between scoring stuff. Where I think long term, if you project that shooting touch at 6'9", the 3-point shooting will probably be somewhere like at worst. I mean, looking at a guy who will probably be like a 35% shooter off the catch in the league.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? I think year 4, year 5, that's really probably where he'll fall on the bottom end of his returns. And at the top ends, you got a guy who has, if he figures it out, has a chance to explode into one of the better like off-ball scoring options in the NBA. Um, I mean, there's some stuff there with the finishing where it's just like, dude, like what even is that? Like attempt. I mean, just the layup stuff is just pretty weak. Like 47.4% on layups, like you're talking about at 6'9" is just like inexcusable. And I think some of it, like you said, is a matter of the situations he's getting himself into. Um, and I think it's the opposite conversation you have with Kasparas, where it's like Kasparas has all these things that you don't have to coach into him. Hayes has a lot of things that you have to coach into him probably in the NBA. And I think that that's like why I probably have him at 8 and I don't have him at 3 or 4. Because I think from a raw talent perspective and athleticism, the things that we know that make basketball players star players, he has all that type of stuff.
Wait, did you say
Especially
athleticism?
yeah, I think definitely he has in this class, probably like tier two athleticism. I think he's probably towards like a top 10 athlete in this class.
Ace?
Yeah.
Ah,
I mean, I don't think with the ball in his hands at all, but I
yeah,
think,
that's what
uh,
I'm saying is
yeah,
what
I mean,
it's hard. I mean,
that's not always what I boil athleticism down to. But I mean, it's definitely something that I think if you're trying to project him as a creator in any fashion, it's something that, I don't think his handle or side to side agility is anywhere near quick enough, and I think it's also what inhibits him on the defensive end from being a premier lockdown defender. I don't think he has tremendous like side to side agility, but I think he has good verticality. I
mhm.
think we talk about like athletic gifts. I'm sure his hand measurements are going to come out well, and his wingspan's going to probably be a plus.
Yeah,
So I
I'd
think,
agree.
and I don't think he'll be slow by any means, but I don't think he'll be fast. So I think that there will definitely be like a case for him at the end of the year again when we all return to these conversations and the full body of work is there. We have all these sporadic games like the Indiana game, and then you get your and even the Indiana game obviously has its gripes where it's rare as a rookie you're ever going to get to shoot 29 shots in a game.
Hmm.
Or even if you have to be getting paid a lot of money for a team to give you that type of freedom. um
Uh-huh.
but you get your Wisconsin games where it's 3 for 16, 2 for 11 from two, 1 for 5 from three, 2 for 6 from the free throw line.
Yeah,
But I mean, you return. Yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, I
No,
the
it becomes tough. It becomes tough to want to put that guy really high because it's like that's a clear detriment to winning. You know what I mean?
Well, the question, right. I mean, the question you can really boil it down to with uh Ace is at the end of the day, like, look, I don't think that guy's going to be a number one or number two scoring option in the NBA just because these looks are so hard. I mean, his
Hmm.
true shooting is like 54. He
Hmm.
takes so many of these mid-range shots. It's just not how the game is sort of played and won. And so if he's not one of your top two scoring options, would you really would you rather have that guy on your team or would you just live with trying to beat him and game plan for him? And for someone who's, you know, his passing decision making actually is not terrible in my opinion, but his passing execution is not very good. For someone who projects to probably be a minus passer on the perimeter, who has a penchant for the kind of shots that he has a penchant for, like I can understand how most teams would rather say, yeah, we'd rather just try to beat him and guard him straight
Hmm.
up. And like the team that we construct will probably beat whatever team is putting Ace on the floor. But having said that, he is very young and he certainly has skill in getting these shots off. There's no question. And if he extends his range, as weird and bad a marker as 58% from the line is, if he extends that 51% on mid-range shots out to three, if that eventually happens and he's dealing with NBA space, and I mentioned earlier that I don't think Rutgers' talent around them is very good, and it's not. But if he's on an NBA floor and he's getting a bunch of catch and shoot looks and he grows as an athlete, he's 6'8", 6'9" now. Maybe when he's done growing, because he's like a young kid, even for the class, maybe he's 6'11". Then this
Hmm.
stuff starts to become a little bit more interesting. I I tend to think that the feel stuff, the passing feel stuff, really does matter. And I think it's hard to really dream on it, but I think Gigi and Whitmore are good. Those are good names to bring up as recent
Yeah.
guys that have fallen for some of these similar concerns. And Gigi like popped by the end of his rookie year. Now Gigi's hurt and the Grizzlies are loaded, so we'll see how he assimilates on like a title contender. I'm really interested to see that if he
Yeah.
comes back this year. And Whitmore is starting to carve out his place now that, Tari and Jabari are hurt in
But I mean, who
Houston.
better? I mean, it's like when you're trying to build a team of guys that are like that, Jalen Wells, Jake LaRavia, who better to throw out there with them sometimes than a guy who's going to be able to go get those shots and do those like superstar things for a moment, like have a play that makes you go, wow. Some of these shots that Ace makes just have your jaws drop. I mean, to give like the listener or viewer perspective, I mean, just how kind of like silly some of this like comes down to, where it's like, on catch and shoot shots, um, overall he's 61.5% on twos, 35.6% on threes. On guarded 2-point field goals on catch and shoot shots, he's 70%, and he's 41.9% from three on catch and shoot guarded shots. But you take away the defender, and he's 33% on twos, and he's 21.4% on threes. He's
Yeah. Well, and you said
20,
at the top that what you
a
like to use most.
20% differential
Well, what
when
would
you
you like
take
to
away
use
the
most is
defender.
unguarded catch and shoot looks in your projection. I mean, and that I like to use that stuff a lot too. Like how, because it mimics free throws. How you do when you are just in rhythm and receiving the ball, how automatic that is, tends to be pretty predictive, as opposed to someone who sort of needs, needs the sort of one-on-one environment for
Mhm.
there to be in rhythm, because like that stuff is not guaranteed at the NBA level. In fact, NBA offenses explicitly discouraged looking for those kinds of looks.
Mhm.
So it is difficult, but you can't just like write it off with some of
Mhm.
this stuff, especially given how young Ace is, because he is young. So and he has positional size, because he could probably with his lateral movement, he could probably play the three in the NBA. I think so. I think he is likely to come off the bench early in his career because he's not going to be efficient enough to start. But when he reaches his prime age and he's in his mid 20s and he's been in the NBA for 6 years, because I don't think Ace is going to wash out. I think he's too good to do that. Then, given where his body's at and how he's learned to assimilate in the NBA game and how he's learned to sort of get some off ball layups in a good system, you can imagine a top 10 outcome for him. You could probably
Mhm.
imagine something higher than that. I mean, you look at where GG and Cam are, I think they're both ahead of where most people predicted they would be pre-draft, which argues for a pretty aggressive placement on Ace. It's just he we'll probably talk about him more in part two a little bit, because I still haven't sorted my entire thoughts on him. A fascinating player, though. Fascinating player who I personally am rooting for, because I
Mhm.
do think his motor runs hot and he really does care. But like
Dude,
I'm
he
like
loves the hoop. I mean, he
he
reminds
does.
me, he honestly, like some of his scoring in terms of like his approach reminds me a little bit of like a young Kevin Durant that knew like he was supposed to like average 30 a game someday. Like if Kevin Durant like came back from the future, but like, like basketball, you can't always just, not everybody's gonna make every shot, even if it's a perfect shot. You know what I mean? Like Kevin Durant knows he's supposed to be this great player, so then he goes out and just chucks. You know what I mean? That's how I kind of envision like Ace Bailey is kind of like he's kind of this guy who's got it wrapped into his head that he's the best shot maker in this draft class. So he's going out to show us consistently night in and night out that he's the best shot maker in the draft class. And when we say like, oh, Ace doesn't play any defense, we can't really say that because the dude's putting up stock numbers. He shows up on the defensive end, at least from an effort standpoint. For the most part, I think there's a lot of effort errors all over that team.
Yeah,
Um,
there is.
but
It's not pretty watching Rutgers.
yeah, but I mean, but that hasn't changed. And I mean, we knew that coming into the year. But I mean, this is where I kind of expected him. I mean, I kind of expected maybe us to get like the one or two. I mean, I was gonna tweet it out. I was gonna say, well, here's the ace game that everybody's been waiting on. Like, you know what I mean? Like, here, go try and make sense of this 40-point conundrum and menagerie of shot taking that took place. And it's difficult, and it's definitely like you said, like somebody who's super high on Whitmore, you know what I mean, had him top five. Somebody who's
Hmm.
super high
I think
on
I had
GG,
him seventh. Yeah,
you know, I
liked
mean,
him a lot.
I had GG and Cam, at top 10. So, you know what I mean? I'm not gonna write a guy like Ace off. I like those guys more. I think GG's a better shooter than Ace is from deep, and I think Cam's obviously clears any prospect in the last couple of classes as a powerful athlete, in my
Hmm.
opinion.
Hmm.
Uh, he's in a tier of his own. Shout out Cam Whitmore. You're gonna get to a better spot soon, buddy. I promise. Like you're in it. Miami is gonna look fucking awesome on him.
Okay. All right. Okay.
No, I'm
Well,
joking. Thank you.
On that note, Caleb, thank you very much. I will have you back for part two when we get into Derek and a lot of these other guys that are not even freshmen, even though there's a couple others in the Big Ten. Thecenterhub.com, the-center-hub.com. The link will be there for anyone who's checking the episode out. Um, Anything for them to look forward to in the immediate future?
I mean, if you're going to look for more Kasparas arguments and takes, I'm not the only one in the Center Hub that's a big fan, and I'm not the only one talking about it. Be sure to go check out On Ball Creator and many of our other content creators. We talked about Sheed and ATL, Paulius in this podcast a handful of times at the top. He's excellent. Go check out the Center Hub. Just not even for just me, for everybody else that's there. Um, they've all done incredible work and people that just care about the game of basketball. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I'm sure that you'll enjoy the 5 or 10 minute reads that we give you once a week that are pretty decent quality and tend to break down philosophical questions. Like, she'd had a Anthony Robinson the second scouting report. But at its core, what we're really talking about is how do we value undersized guards who can't shoot? You know what I mean? So it's
I
always
like Anthony for the record. I don't mean to
he-
chuckle.
he's
I
he's
do
he's
like him.
awesome.
He just needs to get his volume up a little bit from
He's
three.
he's awesome. But I mean, that's the frame of mind that we're always thinking from is what does the big picture look like? So we painted a big picture here. I appreciate you giving me the time, Chuck. It's been a pleasure.
Of course, man. Thank you very much for giving me your time. Thank you all for listening and giving us your time. This has been Chucking Darts. It's okay to be wrong about sports. Find your dartboard and start chucking. Thank you.